Greetings, this is Caroline Staten with Transition US, and thank you so much for joining our online event today. Our principal aim is to provide practical support to the leaders of transition initiatives, those who are mulling over starting an initiative, and community leaders working on resilience building within their communities. We want to continue to offer the webinars at no cost, but do ask that you consider making a donation. We have a donation button on the top bar of our website at transitionus.org. So thank you so much in advance to those of you who are able to do this. And this is our third teleseminar in a series of 3 that Marco Vangelisti, our guest today, has offered. And recordings of the other 2 are available on our website in our online training archives. Without further ado, I'll introduce Marco and let him carry us away once again with his amazing overview of the whole financial system. And Marco came to the U.S. from Italy as a Fulbright scholar in mathematics and economics at the University of California in Berkeley. And after a stint in the financial industry, Marco worked as a visual artist on a full-time basis for 5 years and obtained an MFA focusing on the intersection between public art and ecology. He later worked for 6 years for Grantham, Mayo, Otterloo Company, managing investment equity portfolios primarily on behalf of large foundations and endowments. And then in April 2009, Marco left the finance industry and has since been instrumental in the formation and development of the Slow Money Northern California chapter, where he currently leads the investor working group. And Marco is currently developing Essential Knowledge for Transition, a curriculum for engaged citizens to understand the money and banking system, the economic system, and the financial system, and the need to transform these. So that's what Marco's talking to us about today. It's the third again in a series from his Essential Knowledge for Transition curriculum. And today's topic is the economic system. And the current economic crisis is a recurring phenomenon of a structurally unstable economic system. This part of the curriculum looks at the current economic crisis in its historical context, how we dealt with the last major crisis in the 1930s, and how we are counterproductively dealing with it now. It explains the essential features of all the system that makes it unstable and destructive of communities and of ecosystems. And we'll then look at the systemic features of a new economic system that would be compatible with long-term health care of ecosystems and communities. Finally, we will explore the path for the current system as one that democratizes and localizes economic activity and anchors wealth and capital formation in the community. Wow. So, Marco, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Caroline, for the great introduction. And I'm quite thrilled by the opportunity to present to you today, because this really is the culmination of a 2-year project that I assigned myself when I went to transition training, and realized that the movement could benefit from a better understanding of how the economic system actually worked. And the movement had recognized economic instability as one of the problems that communities need to build a resilience response to. So in the process of studying the economic system, I also realized that the money and banking system is what caused our current crisis, and it's very important to understand that and fix it. So that was the topic of the last webinar last month. And since I spent 20 years in finance, I also wanted to show how our investments are creating a lot of the problems we're trying to solve. So that is actually the very first webinar, and you find both of them up on the web. So I want to start with a quote by Abraham Lincoln, and that's on page 2 of the presentation. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we should save our country. And these words could not be more appropriate for our context. And in this presentation, you will probably hear some concepts that might be challenging and somewhat unorthodox. And I'm simply saying we are in a position now where we cannot be afraid of new ideas and to have discussions that go at the root of some of the problems we have. And I would encourage you to review some of the other 2 webinars because they are key to the material I'm presenting, but I don't have time to go back into the material I presented before. And I recognize as I look at the presentation that I have probably enough content for a semester. So trying to do it in an hour is going to be quite a challenge. But on page 3, I'm just going to give you an overview of the ambitious agenda we have. We'll start with the vision for a new economy. In other words, where do we need to go? And then maybe I'll touch very briefly on the money and banking system, and we will look at the economic crisis we're still in and its historical context. And then we'll look at a very important point, which is economic growth. If you listen to the politicians and everybody is talking about we need to grow the economy. But is it really desirable, and what type of economic growth do we need? And this will bring us into the discussion of ecological economics and environmental economics. And I alluded to this in the first part of the very first webinar when I look at the nested hierarchical systems that basically says we're still part of the biosphere, and the biosphere determines the limit of the economic activity and material throughput that we can sustainably carry. And then we basically ask the more fundamental question, which is what is the economy really for? And when we ask that question, we realize that the current economic system is not meeting the purpose of an economy that works for everybody. And so based on the structural design flaws of the current economic system, we can start envisioning a new one that works for everybody. So if you look at slide 4, the main problem we have with the current economic system is that the decision makers are mostly insulated and not bearing the cost and consequences of the decisions they make. And communities, workers, and ecosystems are bearing the cost and consequences, but they're not at the table deciding what happened to them. And I think where we need to go on slide 5 is we need to move towards economic democracy. In other words, the people that are affected by economic decisions need to be at the table. And so if an economic decision has an impact on an ecosystem, on workers, and on communities, the workers and the communities and the representatives for the ecosystems need to be at the table making those decisions. And we'll take a look at how we can move there and what are the examples that we have currently of a systemic alternative to our economic system. So I'll start with money and banking. And again, I don't have 5 minutes for this, but I will encourage you to watch the webinar. We cover this in details. But the basic flaws of the monetary system is right now, because of the way it is designed, all the money that we use is created as debt. And 95% or more of the money we use, which is electronic money, is created by the private banking sector when they make loans. And so this has the problem that the money supply is not stable, because when loans are repaid, the money supply shrinks. And the other problem is that the banks direct that new money in particular sectors of the economy, creating bubbles, like real estate bubbles, financial bubbles, and so on, and therefore create instability in the economic system. And the biggest design flaw of the system is that no one within the system actually creates the money to repay the interest. This causes an impossible contract in the sense that we cannot all repay our debt. There is not enough money to do that. It forces us to grow the economy so that we can borrow more next year to try to keep the game going, and has a direct link to the environmental deterioration that we see. And the third point that links to the loss of democracy that we have experienced is that effectively the private banking sector has the monopoly on money creation. In other words, the money creation function, which is a quintessential government function, has been privatized in the last couple of 100 years. And you can look at my website for the history, or you can look at the webinar on money and banking to understand that. And this is really big because to a certain extent our government has to borrow money, but the private banking sector can create money. And to solve and address all the problems we have, whether it's environmental restoration, fixing our bridges and infrastructure, educating people without settling them with a lot of debt, taking care of an elderly population, and restoring the natural environment for future generations, all of that will eventually require a massive amount of money coming from the government. And the way to do that is really to allow the government to reclaim the money creation function and create money debt-free and spending it into the economy to fix the things we need to fix. So again, very short overview. Please look at the webinar for more details. But I want now to go into the current economic system and the crisis that we're facing. Now, the historical context is very interesting. If you look at page 8, the economic system delivered an increasing standard of living for Americans for about 150 years. I'm showing here about 90 years of history. But the real wages is basically, real means adjusted for inflation, which is what you can actually buy with your wages. And that has gone up every decade of the last 90 decades, basically, if you look back from 1980. And this is the miracle that brought people from Europe to the United States. And if you want, this is the American exceptionalism. In the next slide, that was really supported by the fact that the worker output also grew. In other words, what a worker was able to produce in an hour in terms of real goods and services also went up. And this was basically the miracle of productivity, and was due to education of the masses and technological advancements. But what has happened is that since, if you look at the next page, in the last 40 years, those two lines departed. In other words, the yellow line is the productivity kept rising. In other words, what workers were able to do in an hour of work was more and more, and yet their real wages stagnated. They did not get a fair share of that productivity. It all accrued, basically accrued to capital. In other words, in the economy there is a division between what labor receives of the economic benefits and what capital receives. And so what happened in the last 40 years is that all the benefits of that rising productivity went to capital and not to labor. And so the real wages have been stagnant in the last 40 years. And I want to look at two periods of time from 1949 to 1979, when those two lines were, moving up roughly at the same pace, and then the period from 79 to more recently 2007. And so what happened in those two periods of time, if you look at page 12, is that the real family income by quintile simply means you divide the population in 5 buckets, and you look at their real standard of living. And over the period of time, 1947 to 1979, just about all the people in the economy saw their standard of living roughly double over the period of time. But you see, over the period 1979 on slide 13, the second period, when all the productivity gains went to capital and not to labor, what happened is that the middle class, in fact, the bottom 80% of the population, saw a very minor increase in their standard of living, while the top 20% captured most of it. In fact, if you break that down into the top 10% and 5% and 1%, you can see that the very rich capture most of the benefits of economic growth. And this was due in part to the fact that over the period of time, for example, the taxation system changed tremendously. So for every dollar that the federal government was bringing in income tax from individuals, was bringing in $1.50 from corporate income tax. And now it's 25 cents. And then the shift within the individual income tax went from the rich to the poor. In other words, the very wealthy were paying between 71 and 94% was the top tax bracket from the 40s to 1978, I believe. So what happened is that basically no one told the middle class on page 14 that in the late 70s that their real wages would not have grown. They had become accustomed to thinking that the next year would be better, the next generation would have more wealth than the prior one, and so they compensated with three strategies. Page 15, they had more family members join the workforce, and now the double income couples is the norm. In the 50s and 40s, there was mostly a single breadwinner for the family. People worked longer hours, and people started to borrow. And so on page 16, you can see the total household debt really exploded over the period of time. And you have a little cartoon on page 17. Now everybody is indebted, so the guy panhandling for cash is actually the one that is in best shape of all. And what happened to the employers and the people that are very wealthy, we have already seen. That's page 19, the corporate profits really exploded because if you pay the workers the same amount in real terms, but you get larger and larger productivity out of their hours, then of course corporate profits have gone up a lot. And the other thing that has gone up a lot is page 20, the ratio of what CEO got paid versus the average workers. So in the 70s was about 20 to 1. Now it's more around 200 to 400 to 1, depending on how you count it. And this, page 21, had a dramatic impact on the distribution of household income. And you can see, again, on page 21, the left panel, the bottom four lines basically barely moved, and the yellow is the top 20% of the population. And then you separate out of that the top 1%, and that's really where the largest increases in household income have occurred. And so how did we deal with the crisis, page 22, last time? FDR was elected as a moderate Democrat on a balanced budget platform, and then the crisis really intensified, and so they created Social Security, saying everybody that is old will receive a check from the government until they die. There was unemployment insurance. The federal government actually hired 12.5 million people to do all the things we needed to do. So they built the post offices, the freeways, the bridges, a lot of the buildings, parks, and so on. And remember, the way this was financed was primarily by taxing the very wealthy. The marginal tax rate, the top marginal tax rate was 94% at the time. So, above $35,000, which is the equivalent of, actually $25,000, which is the equivalent of $350,000 in today's dollar. The tax rate was 94%. So you would retain 6 cents, and 94 would be given in taxes, and they would fund all these programs. And the way we are actually dealing with it now, oh, by the way, on page 23, we also put the Banking Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, that ensured financial stability in the banking and financial sector for 50 years until Bill Clinton basically signed the end of Glass-Steagall. And within 10 years, we had the big financial crisis. We had the Securities Act, 1933, and so on. So stricter regulations, massive government spending, and the safety nets, Social Security and unemployment benefits, that's what we did then. Now, right now, page 24, we have a completely different approach. We're doing exactly the wrong thing. We have the sequester, the automatic cuts in government spending. We're thinking about cutting postal office services and employees, proposing cuts in Social Security like the chain CPI. We just cut SNAP, the food stamps. We're reducing pension benefits. In other words, we're doing exactly the opposite of what we did then. And if you go back to the basic understanding of the economic system, and again, I will take a different perspective, but let's talk about the GDP because that's the measure of whether the economy is growing or not. And the GDP has basically 4 components. C is consumer spending, B is the investments that businesses make, G is government spending, and X minus I is basically the net exports to the rest of the world, so exports minus imports. And in our economy, C is about 70%. In other words, the consumer spending is the bulk of the GDP. Business investing is there when the economy grows, but right now it's not there or is very limited. And the government spending is all the services and the pensions and transfer of benefits that the government engages in. And so if you look at this particular equation, you understand why we're going to be in this slump for quite a bit of time, because the consumer has ran out of admonitions. Usually the consumption in the past was based on the income, but we've seen those incomes have stagnated for the last 40 years on average, right? The real income have remained flat. And so, the middle class had borrowed to the hilt in the last 40 years, but now it cannot really borrow anymore. The businesses are not really investing because they're not seeing the demand out there. And in fact, I have one of the videos that I shared in the registration page on the web is a talk by Nick Hanauer that says rich people do not create jobs. It's really the middle class and the people spending that create the demand for additional jobs and investments. And so the government is the only entity in this picture that can really step in and support aggregate demand, that can support the growth in the economy. And later on, we'll basically deconstruct growth and figure out that it's actually not that great for us. So that's where we are. We are in a situation where the only entity that can really get us out of this pickle, and John Maynard Keynes talked about that in the 30s, is like you get to a place where the rational behavior of individuals and businesses is to contract their expenditure and cut costs. And in aggregate, the aggregate result of that is a spiral that takes you down, because obviously as consumers retrench, businesses also have to cut jobs and services, and that affects the aggregate income in the economy and so on. And so to break that cycle, you really have the government spending. And all the debate about, that the government is borrowing too much and we're going to get in trouble and so on, are really debunked by the fact that, yes, we can simply have the government issue its own money without borrowing it. Why should the government borrow its own money supply from those to whom it ceded the power to create it? And that's basically the talk I gave last time. But I want to touch upon briefly the debate about the economic growth and the growth imperative. It seems like growth is seen, economic growth, as an essential way to benefit the economy and the society at large. But some of you in the transition movement understand that no, we can't grow this thing forever. In fact, we probably have to go into a degrowth environment, and energy is not going to be available and plentiful and so on. So what I want to do simply is page 29. highlight the fact that economic growth is A, not needed, and right now it's actually counterproductive. And I start with this claim that we do not have an economic problem in this country, and this is what Gar Alterowitz uses sometimes. This economy is spectacularly productive in the sense that even though we are not at full employment, the average GDP created by, let's say, an average family of 4 is close to $200,000 a year. We are currently producing about $50,000 worth of GDP per person. So for a family of 4 is $200,000, which means that we don't have an economic problem. We have a distribution problem. A lot of that economic growth and economic activity gets captured by a smaller and smaller percentage of the population. And that's, in fact, what has been shown by a recent study, and I just summarized the results on page 30 by Manuel Saez and Thomas Piketty, two professors, one in Berkeley and one in Paris. And what they looked at is basically they looked at the economic expansions, the 3 most recent ones. And, if theoretically, I mean, they say that the GDP has not stopped contracting, in fact, started expanding in the middle of 2009 until now. But so basically what they asked is that, okay, of that growth in the economy, who benefit from it? Who got it, in terms of income and increase in wealth? And if you look at the chart on page 30, what you see is that during the Clinton expansion of 93 to 2000, the benefits of that growth was split 50-50 between the 1% and the 99%. So the 50-50 is not quite fair, right? But it was basically 50% was captured by the 1%, and the other 50% was captured by the bottom, 99% of the population. In the Bush years, it was basically 1/3 was captured by the 99%, and the top 1% captured just about 2/3 of that. And since 2009, we have 95% of the economic growth has been captured by the 1%. The 99% really got basically nothing. And so when we're talking about economic growth as this panacea for the problems we have, we're not paying attention to who captures the benefits of economic growth. And right now, it's not affecting most of the people. And in fact, because we're using natural resources and energy and create pollution and so on, right now we have a disutility of growth overall. We don't need growth. We actually need a better distribution of the wealth we all generate. And so I'm just going to maybe open up very quickly for clarifying questions at this point, and then I'm going to touch very briefly on ecological economics and environmental economics. So does anybody have a hopefully quick question for me?
So press 1 on your keypad if you do, and we'll call on you. Marco, it might be that everyone's following along. Oh, here, Patrick. Quick question?
Yeah, I was just wondering where the statistics come from for how much money you said each household is generating for each person?
Oh, that is right. So the GDP statistics are widely published. I mean, you can go on the the GDP per person is a very common statistic. You can find it on Wikipedia. You can that's like the easiest. You can go to the CIA fact book. I mean, it's like you can just go to Wikipedia. I mean, that is actually the most common number. We know what the GDP of the United States is. You can divide by the population, so you have a GDP per person. So I think in 2012 was 48,500 and something. But that's an easy statistic to get hold of.
Okay, thank you.
And that was it, Marco. So back to the
Okay, great. So let me move on, and I know it's a lot of material, but I simply want to mention that the way we've been looking at the economy so far is according to the model of neoclassical economics, which basically says, individuals are utility maximizer. The more stuff you give them, the happier they are, and yes, they're constrained by their income. And then you have the other entities that are basically the corporations that are maximizing profits, constrained by cost. And if you just let them rip and let the market decide what's happening, you have this nirvana equilibrium and everybody will be happy. That is the neoclassical economics. We are actually seeing that, well, how about pollution? How about natural capital that we don't have to pay for? So environmental economics is one that recognizes that, wait a second, the market doesn't see the natural capital that nature is providing for free. Right? The forest is not charging us for the wood. We can just go and get it, or for the water. And we don't pay for pollution mostly. We can put CO2 in the atmosphere and somebody else will have to deal with it. And so environmental economics, and I talked about this a little bit in the very first webinar, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But environmental economics is basically trying to quantify in dollar terms the unpriced natural capital and the cost of pollution, and then applies again the same mechanisms of the market to decide what is the best allocation of resources. And so you have concepts like the optimal level of pollution, the socially optimal level of pollution, which is really a nonsense if you think about that. But they basically quantify everything in terms of money and then let the market decide. But if you remember the first part, or you might want to review that, slide 38, I talked about the fact that at the end of the day, the biosphere is the large system that imposes limits on whatever we do as humans, so on our social systems, but specifically on the economic system. So if you look at page 39, this is the perspective of ecological economics. It basically says the material throughput of our economy, meaning the things we need as input and the amount of pollution we spit out at the end, has to be limited by the carrying capacity of the ecosystem and its absorptive capacity, the capacity of the ecosystem to absorb a certain amount of waste and metabolize it so that it does not is not damaging to humans or other species and does not deteriorate the functionality of the ecosystem. And that basically says that limits the amount of material throughput that the economy can generate. So that's a completely different perspective. And again, I recognize that a lot of these concepts would require their own webinar. But what I want to do is go now to the question of what is the economy for, to page 40. And maybe we'll step back and say, where does eco come from in terms of its etymological root? And eco comes from oikos, which is a Greek name that means house, household, or family. So ecology is really the study of the household, and the economy is the management of the household. And so the economy on page 42 is, if you look at standard textbooks, is the study of the allocation of limited or scarce resources among alternative competing ends. So page 43 is really a way of organizing input procurement. How do you get the input? How and when do you produce? How do you distribute the goods and services to improve human quality of life and well-being? And I guess the understanding is that we do this to meet our fundamental human needs. And so maybe what would make sense is understand what are the fundamental human needs we have, right? So that's on page 44, where we have psychological need, right? Physiological. We need clean air, clean water, and nourishing food and sleep. So that's basic. And then we need safety, and then we need health, a sense of belonging, meaningful participation, and a sense of contribution to society, and self-actualization and expression. So what we also need to recognize is that for the satisfaction of the basic human needs, page 45, especially oxygen, clean air, and water, and so on, we depend on the ecosystem services that nature provides, which is oxygen production and regulation, soil fertility, water purification, nutrient recycling, climate regulation, crop pollination, disease control, and so on. And so I would propose on page 46 that what the economy should be for is meeting fundamental human needs of everyone in society while preserving the integrity of the ecosystems on whose wealth our own survival and that of future generation depends. So if we agree that an economic system needs to deliver this, that this is the reason why we engage in all the activities and all the production and distribution of goods and so on, then what we recognize pretty soon is that the current system we have is not doing that. And I want to use a quote by Klaus Schwab on page 47. This is one of the very wealthy industrialists that founded the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And if you have $40,000 to sign up for it, you can attend the next one, although I believe it's still invitation only. So money might not be enough. But if you are very wealthy and you have a really big business, or you are a head of state or some sort of big mucky-muck with $40,000 to spend, you can actually go to the World Economic Forum or be invited to it. And he actually opened the 2012 World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland last year, actually 2 years ago in 2012, by saying capitalism in its current form no longer fits the world around us. And this is a very interesting opening sentence from someone who is obviously one of the top, if you want, the most successful capitalists out there. And so what I've been doing the last couple of years is trying to understand what are the structural problems of this economic system that has a name, and it's called capitalism. So it's on page 48. And this is just a very quick summary of an article that I posted, and it's one of your links in the sign-up page, is Our Current Economic System and the Next, if you want to get a little bit more into details. But from what I can understand, the key problems with capitalism are the commodification of nature and labor. In other words, nature is a commodity. We can just take it and sell it for what is worth on the commodity market, and the same happens with labor. So we have a labor market, and the time of people is bought and sold based on supply and demand considerations. And if you remember the chart about the labor productivity that kept rising in the last 150 years, that is a problem if you are providing your labor in the labor market, because that means less and less of your time and labor is needed because it is so productive. And so because of that, a lot of people are unemployed, or the type of jobs that they can get are paying less and less in real terms. And then there are other things, like fundamental needs are denied based on affordability, right? If you cannot afford health care, you're going to be sick. If you cannot afford food, you're going to go hungry, like the 40 million Americans that are food insecure. There's also a trend towards larger economic entities. And the last 3 slides in your presentation will show you a couple of examples in a couple of industries. And so when you have larger entities that have more political power, and they destroy the competition, which is at the core of that idea of the invisible hand that makes everything work, because people are competing to provide what people really want. There is also the issue of concentration of economic power and loss of competition. The profit motive takes precedence over life, and you can see that in many examples, including the healthcare system. If you think about the fact that the mostly for-profit healthcare system we have in the United States is much more expensive than in other countries, delivers not great results. I think we're 23 among the industrialized countries in terms of health outcomes, and yet it's so expensive that many people cannot afford it, and it was estimated that 45,000 people a year die because they don't have access to health care. And that's an example of profit taking precedence over life. If we had single-payer health care, or a system like in Europe where everybody's covered, there wouldn't be so much profit for certain sectors like the health insurance industries and the pharmaceutical companies. That might still be profitable, but not as much, but we would have less people dying for it. And the reliance on markets tends to lead to exploitation of externalities. In other words, you exploit the things that you don't have to pay for. Think about pollution and other things. And there's this internal contradiction of labor seen as cost, right? So if you're a company, a business, labor is a cost for you, and so the less you pay labor, the more profitable you are, and yet the labor income at the end of the day provides the aggregate demand to buy the products that the businesses produce. And so you have this dichotomy, and labor on one side is a cost, on the other hand is what provides the demand for the things you produce. And finally, the decision makers are insulated from the impact of a lot of the decisions that people have to bear the consequences of. And so on page 49, the promise we have is it's an unstable system that concentrates wealth and power. There's a tendency towards larger entities and reduced competition. It is fundamentally anti-democratic, and it is socially and environmental damaging. And we could argue spectacularly wasteful too, if you think about the fact, just in terms of healthcare. We're spending about 18% of GDP in healthcare in the United States, and the next country that has more of a, if you want, socialized system or more government-provided health insurance system, they pay about 12%. And so we spend $1 trillion extra to keep going a for-profit healthcare system, for example. So there are attempts at fixing it. Page 50, we tried with regulation. There's some shareholder activism. There's the idea of conscious capitalism and triple bottom line, although, when there is a trade-off between profit, planet, and people, sometimes, profit is not the one to go. It's the other two guys. But it's an attempt at getting there. So now I want to go into more the blue sky discussion and say, if those are the issues, the fundamental design flaws of this economic system that we see, and you can see the effects of it just about on any aspect of our society, the educational system, the healthcare, the private prison system, the militarization of just about everything, and how much money there is to be made in engaging in wars and so on. So what is the alternative? What would an alternative economic system look like? And this is just my take, so we could have a discussion. In fact, we should have a discussion, and I would invite you to have a discussion with your neighbors and with your friends about, if we were to redesign this economic system, what would we do? And I would start from the desired characteristics of an economy, right? If we said the economy should be really meeting the fundamental human needs of everyone in society while preserving the integrity of the ecosystems on whose health and our own survival depends, how would we do that? So, we would have various categories to think about. Human needs and labor, the role of the private sector, the role of the public and nonprofit sector. How do we treat nature and property rights? What is the proper role of the market? And, probably the direction we need to look at is decentralization and look at the issues of size and decision making. So I'll just give you a little taste of that, and then we'll open up for questions and see where we go. When you think about human needs and labor, page 52, I think the basic human needs could be met by a national dividend. In other words, once you watch the webinar on money and banking and recognize that the government could actually reclaim the sovereign power to create its own money and do that debt-free, it could decide that that money it creates debt-free, part of that could go towards a national dividend where everybody receives something to just meet the basic needs of food and shelter, let's say. And if you think about a GDP that creates about 50,000 per person right now, you could say, how about 10 or 12,000 a year, is what everybody gets. So you don't have to worry about people starving on the street or being homeless. Then, the issue of, labor productivity and free time, right? I mean, the fact that we become so productive in the last, 50 years should have translated in more free time. And in fact, what translated into is much lower wages because there is an oversupply of labor, and so everybody has to work even longer hours to just meet their basic needs. And so we could structure the economy in a way that people would have more free time and choose to work and do, maybe more meaningful work as opposed to only the work that is offered right now by enterprises. And so another idea is have the government be the employer of last resort, which is what we did in the 30s. In other words, if the for-profit sector, and there is a role for the for-profit sector, of course, is not willing or able to employ the people that want to work, then the government will become the employer of last resort. And again, how do you finance those expenditure is by creating the sovereign money that is then spent to hire these people. And we can do, fix the 70,000 structurally deficient bridges. We can increase education so that we don't have to charge students a fortune for them to get educated, and so on. I mean, you can imagine, restoration of habitats and so on and so forth. And a couple of examples of that, of economic systems that focus on the human needs and labor, is the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation in Mondragon in Spain, and the Cleveland model. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to talk about those, but I just want to show you in a couple of slides what happens if the decision-making structure changes within a corporation. So if you look at page 53, a typical large corporation has a lot of shareholders, a lot of owners if you want, and a lot of workers, but the decision makers are usually the major shareholders, the board of directors, and the CEO and key executives. So it's really a tiny percentage of shareholders and workers. On page 54, the way it works is that major shareholders usually select the board of directors, and the board of directors hires and fires the CEO, and then the CEO picks up the key executives. So that's kind of the chain of decision making. In a worker self-directed enterprise, like for example a worker-owned cooperatives, the workers are the owners, and so yes, you still have maybe a CEO and key executives running the place, and you probably have a board of directors. Some of the members might be outside the company, but the selection process now is the workers are selecting the board of directors. Page 56. That's what's happening, by the way, in all the Mondragon cooperatives. So the workers are picking the board of directors because they are all the owners. And then the board of directors hires and fires the CEO. And so if you contrast the type of decisions that are made on page 57 by large capitalist corporation with the very concentrated decision makers and that of the worker self-directed enterprises, what you see, for example, the ratio of the CEO pay to average workers in the United States, I think 2 years ago, was 380 to 1. And in the Mondragon cooperatives, the ratio is 6 to 1. In other words, people recognize, even in those cooperatives, that the people that need to run need to have specific skills and need to be paid more, but there's a limit. And so the maximum ratio between the highest paid and the lowest paid worker in the Mondragon cooperatives is 6 to 1. And then you can also think about the allocation of profits, right? Right now, allocation of profits in major corporations are either distributed to the shareholders or are held in cash. Right now, corporations are holding on to $1.7 trillion worth of cash because they don't see the reason to invest and expand their production, given the fact that no one can afford to buy a lot of their products. In the Mondragon cooperatives, for example, the decision that was made about the profits is as follows. 10% goes to a fund run by the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation that helps other cooperatives if they get in trouble or help them get started with new capital. 45% are reinvested in the business to improve equipment and so on, and 45% goes to the pension plan of the workers. So, it's a different way of making decisions. And you can think about issues like the use of toxic material, unsafe working condition, or the decision to move the factory to China. Obviously, the worker owners would have a completely different way of solving those decisions or making those decisions, which right now in a classic for-profit corporation would be done to maximize profits. So the role of the private business in the new economic system could be captured by something called the prototype framework. Is a group of accountants that basically said, I think the way we keep score is destroying the environment. We really need to pay attention to other things. And so they proposed this way of looking at a business and say the value added of the business is not just measured based on the profit it generates, but also its impact on the human capital. In other words, are the workers now more skilled and have they grown in terms of their potential, and in terms of intellectual capital, and in terms of in natural capital. And so the value added of a business is really an accounting that takes into account their impact on all these types of capital. And by the way, this would be really illegal in most corporations in the United States, because the C corporation mandates that the company operates to maximize shareholder profits. And so, only the financial capital is the one that people can pay attention to. And the role of the public and nonprofit sector against the government as the employer of last resort, having public work programs. And I think this was even suggested by a very conservative, laissez-faire economist, Henry C. Simon, the founder of the Chicago School, which is very conservative and kind of a free market school in the United States. And the founder, Henry C. Simon, said when companies get too big, they need to be nationalized, otherwise the competition will be destroyed. And so at this point, I think we need to consider nationalizing, the big banks, and turn them into utilities that are operating for the interest of people as a whole, and do that for all key infrastructure things like physical and social. And to a certain extent, that's how the railroads were at a certain point nationalized, when you have the railroad barons basically squeezing everybody to death with extracting too much rent for the use of the railroad, that the economy was really collapsing. And so for key infrastructure, maybe they need to be run as utilities and run for the interest of people as a whole. So I recognize that I've talked for a long time. I just want to maybe mention the last thing, and this may be again a little bit new as a concept. Page 60. Natural ecosystems are really endowments from present and future generations for current species, human species, but also other species on the planet. And so the idea that you could have a property right arrangement where if you own a forest or an intact ecosystem, you can just cut it down and sell it as a commodity and benefit from it. That is, if you think about that, a massive wealth transfer from future generations to this one, because that ecosystem would have provided services for many, many generations to come. And so I think if we need to go to sustainability and trying to maintain the ecosystems and their vitality, we need to think about what property rights can we have, and in terms of land and ecosystems, and maybe those cannot allow the owner to destroy them. I mean, it's probably not something that is fair, given the fact that those ecosystems were built over thousands of years and millions of years of evolution. And who are we in this particular generation, or just a few people, to say, okay, we'll take it all now, and future generation won't have it. And so the idea, there are some examples: land trust and stewardship models, restriction on property rights, and that has land and ecosystems. And the other ideas is, the movement for the rights of nature is another interesting thing. But I talked long enough. I just want to point to slide 63, which is really where we started, which is at the end of the day, we need to have a economic democracy where the people that are affected by economic decisions need to be at the table. And I would just open up for questions at this point and see if anybody has questions or comments.
Christopher Bergstrom.
Hello from Torrance, California, and thank you for this great presentation. In the interim, before we have an improved, say, local banking system or improved economic system, are there things that as individuals we can do to not contribute to the problem? For example, when faced with the task of buying a car, is it better to try and save first rather than take out a loan to make those purchases? Or are those kind of individual actions, you think, Marco, pretty much irrelevant? Or do you encourage people to try and work against the current system just within our abilities right now?
Well, no, individual action is all we have. And in other words, trying to make some change in Washington, I mean, it's not going to happen. We have to take personal responsibility and start organizing and build a movement. And I'm saying, if you think about what's happening right now in terms of, for example, the marriage equality, right, and the gay rights, no politician or, I don't want to say no politician, but, the leadership is not coming from Washington. It's coming from the people that are starting to organize and demand things. So it's all about individual choices. And I would say a couple of things you can do, and I mentioned those in the other webinar. One is move your money from the large banks to the small regional banks and credit unions, because they are doing most of the loans to local businesses. So that's one first step. The other one is, consider the possibility of buying a used car instead of a new one, because when you buy a new car, you're creating the demand for, the material that went into that car and keep the growth going. I see the use of credit as positive in certain things. I mean, it's like if you need a car to go to a job, then you cannot wait to have saved enough to buy a car before you get to your job, right? I mean, so the credit has a function in society, and I would say get it from local banks or local credit unions. And the other one is support worker-owned cooperatives or social enterprises. Find out if you can do local import substitution. If you're buying something like either food or vegetables, can you buy it from a local farm? Can you sign up for a CSA? In other words, the idea is that trying to relocalize as much as possible of our economic and financial activities. If you have investments in Wall Street, consider moving some of that money locally and engage with a slow money group or a local investing group. So it's all about the individuals. And what happens is that as more individuals act with their personal choices, you are building a movement and the power to shift things. And this is a little bit if you think about that, I mean, Walmart has organic. It's the largest seller of organic produce, right? I mean, and I'm not a fan of Walmart, but I'm saying the preferences expressed by individuals and their choices to, buy organic cause changes in a company that would not have taken the lead to go in that direction. So personal choices are really what we're left with mostly now.
Thank you.
Kimberly, go ahead.
Oh, hi. In a sense, the last call answered my question, and I also want to say thank you. It was terrific, and I'm going to go watch the other two, which I missed. But I think the issue I see is just that people are used to having an expert who sort of learns everything about an area and guides the ship, and they don't feel they have the time. Least of economics really puts people off, I guess, math, science. And so I don't know. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about conveying the message to people and making it accessible to them.
Well, that's exactly why I am looking at the large system and trying to explain them in layman's term, because I think we need to understand how they work. And to a certain extent, because they've been made so complicated and the lingo has been so specialized, this allowed a small elite to have access to privileged information and to make decisions that affect us without us really knowing. And so I think that's the reason why I developed this program, why I have this 3 webinars, and I'm quite excited that now will be up on the web. And I would say if you, if you found this information useful, get together with some friends and show the webinar and have a discussion and look at the other 2. And I think that is really powerful in what we need to do now. We are kind of an isolated culture with our little electronic devices. And I think we need to rediscover the power of coming together with people in the same room, in the same space, and have an intelligent conversation about how we want to live on this planet and how we want to structure our society, and start there. And so hopefully these 3 resources that will be available, the recording of the 3 webinars would be something that can be used as a starting point for a deeper discussion with your neighbors and your friends about these issues.
And Marco, it might be a good time to remind people of your website, which is loaded with additional resources. So can you give us that your website address?
Yeah, the website is ek4t.com. Stands for Essential Knowledge for Transition, and you can find information there. Also, the archive page on the Transition US under Training will have a number of the resources that I shared this time. Those can also be used to learn more about it. So ek4t.com, number 4.
And Sherry, we'll go to you next.
Oh, hello, Marcos. It's Sherry Heinrichs. I wanted to address something that was brought up. There are multiple ways of not doing business with the big banks, which you addressed. And one of the things I work with is showing people how to be their own bank, so that their money, although they're working with a credit union or whatever for the regular checking and such, what they can do is use their own assets to purchase a vehicle or, say, stock in slow money projects and such, and pay themselves back at interest, growing their assets instead of sending that money out to the financial industry. And this allows people to have a lower debt and lower taxes. So there are things that are available out there, and there are mutual companies that work for the people and not for the big business. So I'd like to talk to you about that more, off this
call. All right, sounds good. Yeah. You can contact me at info@ek4t.com. So if you want to contact me.
Thank you.
And Janice Lynn, go ahead.
Hi, I'm in Fort Collins, and I'm part of a thing called the Colorado Community Rights Network, which is doing something that's kind of parallel to what you're talking about in terms of trying to get legislation that will actually help us have community rights, including rights of nature. We're trying to address the huge fracking problem that we have along the Front Range of Colorado that is polluting like crazy. And so I just would like to know what your take. Have you heard of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, the Community Rights Movement, and what your take is on that?
I love Tom Lindsay and Marty Margill. I mean, they are my personal heroes. I took the very first democracy school that was taught in California by Tom Lindsay of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Yes, this is a grassroots movement to drive community rights and rights of nature into local ordinances and local constitutions, which is the only avenue we have left now to try to defend our self-determination as individuals and as communities. So I am a big fan of the work of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Everybody should check out CELDF.org and learn more about it, because the way the whole legal system is set up is primarily to protect property rights and to preempt decision-making and self-determination by communities. So one could argue that sustainability is almost illegal in this country, because if it interferes with the potential profits of corporations that have a legal use permit to do, whether it's fracking or water withdrawal or so on, communities affected can simply not say no. They are preempted by state laws or by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So eventually what we have to do is we'll have to rewrite those constitutions, and we'll start from the local ones, which are the things that communities are doing to protect their rights to say no to things that are damaging to their health and their ecosystems.
Well, I'd just like to add that we are doing a ballot initiative for 2014. If it doesn't pass, we'll go for 2016 in Colorado to change the Constitution to deal with preemption. So I want people to know that.
Great.
Yeah, in fact, Colorado is at the forefront with Pennsylvania to organize at the state level for that. So that's great. You guys are doing really pioneering work.
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up now. I want to just really thank you so much, Marco, for these 3 in-depth teleseminars that you've offered, and all of your knowledge. I know that we're just scratching the surface, and hope you come back and deliver some future chapters for us as your thinking continues, in various directions. And thank you to all of our wonderful participants today and the great questions. So, Marco, any final comment from you?
I would say the most important thing is to build a study group or an action group. So get together with some friends, share the information, and then pick a topic and explore it and figure out how you can apply it or do something about it. In other words, I think that's what happened during the women's liberation movement. I mean, somebody said, the power comes out of a group of 6 people, 5 or 6 people supporting each other, learning, and taking action. So it's really time to reconnect, leave maybe the electronic devices behind, and start meeting more face-to-face to figure out how to solve the many problems we have.
And that brings me back to the transition movement, to sort of the first step is to organize on that smallest scale with people that are interested, and yes, invite them to your home. Watch one of these teleseminars that are recorded, bring some food and have some good discussion, and really see what you might want to create in your locales. So lots of more resources on our website at transitionus.org.